Today we'll talk about the Battle of Panipat. It was fought between the forces of the British East India Company and the Maratha Empire in 1761 near the old town of Panipat in the modern state of Haryana, India. The battle resulted in the decisive victory of the Afghans, who were assisted by the British over the Marathas. As a result of the battle, the Marathas lost their dominance in northern India and the Afghans gained full control over the rich and important trade hub of Punjab. Before discussing the battle itself, let's quickly take a look at the history of the Marathas and the Afghans in India. Originally, both were indigenous people of the Indian subcontinent. The word Maratha comes from the word Maravi, which means those who have adopted the military way of life. Initially, they were a local tribe of warriors who lived in the western Ghats mountain range in the Deccan. However, under the reign of Shivaji Maharaj, the Marathas grew into a significant power that dominated most of the Indian peninsula. After his death in 1680, the Maratha kingdom was ruled by his sons and grandsons. But the growing internal conflicts within the family created several factions. This resulted in the weakening of the empire. Therefore, the ambitious Maratha leaders started to conquer more territories outside the Deccan in order to compensate for this internal weakness. Balaji Bajirao, the Peshwa of the Maratha Empire, is considered one of the most accomplished military commanders in the history of India. He was successful in expanding the Maratha territory from the Arabian Sea in the west to the Bay of Bengal in the east. One of his major accomplishments was conquering the northern Indian states of Punjab and Sindh, but after his death, the control over these regions was lost. The Afghan Empire also originated in India. They were originally known as the Lodi dynasty and ruled in the Delhi Sultanate before they expanded northwards and founded the Sur Empire. However, after Sher Shah Suri's death, the Sur Empire collapsed and the Afghans were pushed back to the hills of what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. These Afghans belonged to the Abdali clan and were led by Durrani Shah, who established the Afghan Empire in 1740. Ahmed Shah Abdali's goal was to restore the former glory of the Sur Empire, and he was successful in conquering much of Punjab, Kashmir, and Sindh from the weakened Mughal Empire. In addition, he also had conflicts with the Marathas who were occupying parts of Punjab. In 1759, Ahmad Shah Abdali invaded Punjab in an attempt to clear the remaining Maratha forces from the region. The Marathas were indeed weak due to the ongoing internal power struggles. Therefore, Ahmad Shah Abdali won victories at the battles of Giri, Sundar, and Lahore. After concluding a peace treaty with the Marathas, he returned to Afghanistan. The treaty obligated the Marathas to evacuate Punjab without taking any booty with them. However, despite this agreement, the Marathas returned to Punjab 2 years later. They hoped that the recent successes of the French centers in southern India would encourage the Afghans not to start a war. But this hope was in vain. Both sides gathered troops and prepared for battle. The Maratha army was mainly composed of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The battle took place on January 14, 1761, near the old town of Panipat, which is about 90 kilometers north of Delhi. The armies met on the open ground about 10 kilometers from the city. Before the battle, the Afghan commander received a message from the Maratha leader offering to divide Punjab between them. If he accepted the proposal, there would be no bloodshed. But the Afghan refused the offer and went to war. There is some debate regarding the sequence of events during the battle, but the general consensus among historians is that the Afghan forces initially attacked first. The Afghan army consisted mainly of horse and therefore opted for a cavalry charge to break through the enemy lines. At the same time, the Marathas used their superior artillery to fire upon the advancing Afghans. As the battle progressed, the Maratha guns caused heavy casualties and forced the Afghans to halt their attack. The Afghans then sent a large group of cavalry to capture the Maratha artillery. Meanwhile, the main Afghan force engaged the rest of the Maratha army. Seeing that the enemy's artillery was being threatened, the Maratha commander, Sadasiva Rao, left his position and rode towards the artillery to protect it. This maneuver divided the Maratha army and made it easier for the Afghans to defeat them. Some sources also say that the Maratha commander was killed in the battle. However, this claim is disputed as there is no concrete evidence to prove it. While the battle was still going on, a second Afghan force arrived. It was led by Timucuddin, the governor of Lahore, who had previously defeated the Marathas in the Battle of Lahore. With the arrival of reinforcements, the Afghans were able to surround the Marathas and inflict heavy casualties on them. The Marathas were trapped and started to flee the battlefield. The Afghans pursued them relentlessly and killed many more Marathas. The fighting continued until late in the evening. And when it finally ended, the battlefield was strewn with the bodies of the dead and wounded. After the battle, Ahmad Shah Abdali returned to Afghanistan and the rest of Punjab to the Afghans. It is said that over 200,000 soldiers died during the battle, although some historians consider this number too high. Regardless, it is evident that the losses were extremely heavy. The Afghans suffered defeats in the Third Battle of Panipat. However, the defeat did not weaken their hold over the region. Instead, they benefited from the destruction of the Maratha power base in northern India. For the Marathas, on the other hand, the loss of so many soldiers at the Battle of Panipat was a major blow from which they never recovered. They did launch several retaliatory campaigns against the Afghans, but all of them proved unsuccessful. The Battle of Panipat marked the end of Maratha dominance in northern India. Regarding the role of the British in the battle, it is important to mention that they did not participate directly in the fighting. Their objective was merely to weaken the Marathas and help the Afghans defeat them. The British were interested in controlling the lucrative Indian trade in their own right and saw the Marathas as an obstacle to their plans. By supporting the Afghans against the Marathas, they successfully eliminated a rival power in the region. The consequences of the Third Battle of Panipat had far-reaching effects on the course of Indian history. The decline of the Mughal Empire paved the way for the British to establish their supremacy in India. The British East India Company gradually expanded its territory, and by the mid-19th century, it had become the dominant power in the Indian subcontinent. The Afghans, on the other hand, continued to rule in Punjab until the early 19th century, when they were eventually conquered by the British. I hope you found this video interesting. If you want to learn more about ancient battles, stay tuned. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Mughal Emperor Babur was the first ruler in India to use field artillery. He completely changed the way wars were fought in the subcontinent by introducing this Western technology he had acquired from his military experiences in Central Asia, and this is how it happened. The year is 1526 CE, and the location is the First Battle of Panipat. On one side of the field is an army of some 40,000 men led by the Afghan warlord Ibrahim Lodi. On the other side is a much smaller force of around 12 to 13,000 troops led by Babur, a young Central Asian conqueror who had just crossed over into India with his small but well-trained army. The two forces are about to collide in what will be a decisive battle for the future of India. Now, at first glance, the Afghans have a massive advantage in numbers. They also enjoy the support of the local rulers, most of whom were not happy with Babur's territorial ambitions. But the biggest factor in their favor was the use of elephants. War elephants, to be precise, which were widely employed by all the major powers in India and Central Asia at the time. They were considered almost invincible. In fact, some historians say that there were as many as 400 war elephants in the Afghan ranks that day. For perspective, Babur's entire army had only 2. So needless to say, the Afghans felt confident of a swift victory against the Central Asian invaders. But they had completely misjudged their enemy. You see, despite being outnumbered, Babur's army was composed of elite shock troops, many of whom were veterans of his conquests across Central Asia. In addition to having superior weaponry, including firearms and artillery, they were also well-trained in the art of mounted archery. This gave them a huge advantage over their opponents, the Afghans, who were mostly infantry. To add to the latter's woes, Babur's army was also better organized and disciplined. What happens next is legendary. Despite their numerical superiority, the Afghans were routed and forced to flee the battlefield, thanks to Babur's brilliant military tactics and superior weaponry. He would go on to establish the Mughal Empire in India, which would rule most of the subcontinent for the next 2 centuries. But the real star of the show was the artillery. Babur's introduction of field artillery, or portable cannons that could be moved around the battlefield, completely changed the face of warfare in India. The Afghans had never seen anything like it before, and neither had anyone else in the subcontinent. You see, although warfare in India goes back thousands of years, the weapons used in battles remained largely unchanged during the early centuries. Swords, spears, bows and arrows, catapults, standard medieval stuff. Gunpowder was known in India since ancient times, but it wasn't until the 14th century that it started being used for warfare. By then, the Delhi Sultanate and the various Rajput kingdoms were using basic hand cannons and some rudimentary forms of rockets. But this was hardly any match for the sophisticated firearms used by the likes of Babur. In fact, the use of firearms in India was so limited that it was often considered more of a novelty than a serious weapon of war. But Babur saw its potential and deployed it extensively in his campaigns. At the Battle of Panipat, he used 3 different types of artillery. There was the medium mortar called the bombard, which fired high-powered shells, the smaller but quicker-firing falcon, which was designed to shoot down enemy cavalry charges, and the gigantic but slow-firing cannons called the Monmat and the Magmal Dera, whose very size and imposing presence was enough to demoralize the enemy. The Afghans certainly fit the bill because they charged repeatedly, only to be decimated every time by the deadly combination of Babur's shock troops and his artillery. As we mentioned earlier, Babur introduced field artillery in India. Basically portable cannons that could be moved around the battlefield. Before him, siege warfare was mostly associated with large cannons that were permanently installed and pointed towards a city wall or a castle gate. But Babur's guns were different. He used them right in the middle of the action, blasting away the enemy formations and creating havoc in their ranks. Babur had a total of 80 pieces of artillery at his disposal in Panipat, all of which were acquired from his father and grandfather. But he would go on to expand his arsenal exponentially after conquering India. By the end of his reign, the mules had more than 600 field guns, each weighing several tons. And this firepower was unmatched by any of his rivals in the subcontinent. In fact, the impact was so profound that even the mighty kingdom of Vijayanagara, which was known for its advanced military technology, relied heavily on artillery to win its battles. The introduction of field artillery by the Portuguese in India in the 16th century made a huge difference to their military capabilities. Although the early guns were inaccurate and unreliable, they soon became a common sight on Indian battlefields. By the end of the 17th century, the Marathas were also using artillery pieces that rivaled the mules. But the impact of these developments was limited to only a handful of kingdoms. Most of the regional powers simply couldn't afford such expensive toys, let alone develop the infrastructure required to manufacture them. For example, the Kingdom of Mysore didn't acquire its first cannon until 1660 when it received a bronze piece from the Dutch. Similarly, the Kingdom of Travancore got its first gun, the Yapa, only in the mid-18th century. But these late starters soon caught up with the artillery-obsessed powers and began deploying them in their armies. Artillery played a key role in Mysore's victory over the British in the Anglo-Mysore Wars. In fact, it was considered so crucial that Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore, built a special foundry at the foot of the Chamundi Hills to manufacture cannons exclusively for his military. He would later shift this factory to Bangalore Fort, where he set up a full-blown artillery school to train soldiers in its use. All the while, the British East India Company was also expanding its arsenal. It first imported artillery from Europe, but gradually started manufacturing its own guns in India. By the mid-19th century, the company was producing an impressive array of cannons, including several 24-pounders and 18-pounder howitzers. Although the British never disclosed the number of guns in their possession, historical records suggest that they had quite an impressive arsenal, especially after capturing Tipu's capital of Seringapatam in 1799. The British also learned from their experience in India and realized that a good artillery strategy was not just about having big guns, it was also about having the right people to operate them. The British thus introduced the post of the Royal Artillery, an elite force of soldiers specially trained in the use of artillery. These soldiers were recruited from among the British populace and given intensive training in the use of artillery. They were then sent to India, where they formed the backbone of the British artillery units. Over time, they were joined by Indians who were also recruited and trained in the use of artillery. However, the British were hesitant to give Indians command positions in the artillery, perhaps because they did entrust them with such important responsibilities, or perhaps because they wanted to keep the lucrative military contracts in the hands of the British. Whatever the reason, it would take decades for Indian officers to reach influential positions in the artillery. In the meantime, the British artillery would play a key role in the expansion of the East India Company's power in India. The massive 24-pounder cannons proved particularly useful, repelling rebellions, such as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. By the end of the 19th century, the British had established several artillery regiments in India. Some of these regiments were equipped with heavy guns, such as the 4.7-inch naval cannons, while others had lighter weapons, such as the 2-pounder mountain guns. The British also introduced new artillery tactics into the Indian military. They used artillery to provide covering fire for their troops, to bombard enemy positions, and to counter enemy artillery. These tactics proved highly effective and helped the British to dominate the Indian subcontinent. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about the Indians. Although the Indian kingdoms did adopt artillery, they were never able to match the British. The Indian artillery lacked the sophistication and training of its British counterpart and was often used in a haphazard manner. For example, the Mysore artillery was never able to fully recover from the loss of its skilled European technicians after the fall of Seringapatam. As a result, the guns fell into disrepair and the artillery's effectiveness declined sharply. Similarly, the Maratha artillery, which had been a formidable force in the 18th century, was decimated during the Third Anglo-Maratha War. Despite these setbacks, the Indian kingdoms continued to use artillery throughout the 19th century. The Sikh Empire, for instance, had a well-trained artillery force that played a key role in their victories against the Afghans and the British. Likewise, the Kingdom of Nepal also had a strong artillery tradition and was one of the few powers to successfully resist the British in the early 19th century. However, none of these kingdoms were able to match the British in the long run. The British artillery was simply too powerful and too well-trained to be defeated. And that's all for today. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new. If you did, don't forget to leave us a like and subscribe so you never miss out on our latest episodes. Why did Babur's army defeat Ibrahim Lodi's army? The year was 1526 and the location was Panipat in India. Ibrahim Lodi's soldiers outnumbered Babur's soldiers by almost 3-1, yet Babur's small army defeated Ibrahim Lodi's huge army. What tactics made this possible? This is a story from history. Ibrahim Lodi was the ruler of Delhi. His father had built the Lodi dynasty after defeating the last Sayyid ruler of Delhi. Ibrahim was not interested in ruling an empire. He liked drinking and partying, but his mother, Mahim Begum, managed the empire efficiently. She appointed capable ministers and officials, and the revenue started pouring in. But she could not control her son. One day, Ibrahim was hosting a big party with lots of food and drink. Suddenly, he noticed that the wine was not chilled enough. In a fit of rage, he picked up a silver goblet and hurled it at a servant. The goblet hit a woman and she fell down. It was no ordinary woman. It was a dancer named Garo, who was the foster sister of Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire. When Babur heard about the incident, he decided to take revenge. He assembled his army and marched toward Delhi. Ibrahim's army outnumbered Babur's army 3-1, but the quality of Babur's troops was much better. Most of Ibrahim's soldiers were infantry, foot soldiers who fought on the ground. They carried long spears or swords. Some of them also used bows and arrows. On the other hand, most of Babur's soldiers were cavalry, horse riders who fought while on horseback. Cavalry were deadlier than infantry. Also, most of Babur's soldiers were well trained. He had hired many European soldiers known as the Italian Band. They were disciplined, well-trained, and efficient. Besides these two factors, there were three more reasons why Babur's army defeated Ibrahim Lodi's army. The first reason was the artillery. It refers to the use of cannons and firearms to attack the enemy from a distance. Both armies used artillery during the battle, but the quality of their guns varied. Babur's artillery was far superior to Ibrahim Lodi's artillery. For example, Babur used a special type of cannon called the bombard. These were large cannons that could shoot high-powered cannonballs. They were mounted on wheels, so they could be moved around easily. Another advantage was the matchlock musket. This was a new type of firearm that had just arrived in India from Europe. It was more powerful than the traditional firearms used by Indian soldiers. The matchlock musket could shoot faster and more accurately. The soldiers could load the gun using a long ramrod from the end of the barrel. Some of these muskets could also shoot 2 or 3 bullets without having to be reloaded. All these advantages enabled Babur's artillery to cause heavy casualties among Ibrahim's troops. At the same time, Ibrahim's artillery could not cause much damage to Babur's troops. Reason No. 2. Ibrahim Lodi's army was not united. Most of his soldiers were not loyal to him. They belonged to different kingdoms and had been brought together by force. They did not like each other and often fought among themselves. Furthermore, Ibrahim's army did not have a good commander. Ibrahim himself led the army. He was not a bad fighter, but he was not a good commander. As a ruler, he was concerned with pleasures and luxuries. He had no interest in military matters. On the other hand, Babur was a brilliant commander. He was a student of military arts. He knew how to use his soldiers effectively. He also knew how to keep his troops motivated, and most importantly, he knew his enemy. He had studied the strengths and weaknesses of Ibrahim's army and he exploited them fully. Reason No. 3. Ibrahim Lodi's army was not properly equipped. Some of his soldiers did not even have weapons. The ones who had weapons did not have proper armor. Babur, on the other hand, made sure that all his soldiers were well equipped. He distributed the best weapons and armor to his soldiers. This was one of the main reasons why Babur's soldiers could fight more effectively. They were not afraid of being attacked because they knew that they were well protected. Also, they could attack the enemy without worrying about their own safety. They knew that if they died in battle, their families would be taken care of. This is because Babur introduced a system of pensions for the soldiers' families. This system was unheard of in India at the time. No other ruler provided for the families of his soldiers. Babur also made sure that his soldiers were paid on time. He knew that hungry and angry soldiers are not very effective soldiers. By taking care of his troops, Babur built their loyalty. They liked their leader and were ready to die for him. Ibrahim, on the other hand, did not care about his troops. He did not pay them well and often kept them without food. As a result, his soldiers were not loyal to him and did not fight very hard. In the end, all these factors led to the defeat of Ibrahim Lodi's army. Babur's army was smaller but better trained and equipped. Babur's cannons were more powerful and accurate. Most importantly, Babur's soldiers were loyal to him. Ibrahim's army, on the other hand, was not well trained. His soldiers were not loyal to him and his cannons were not very effective. After winning the battle, Babur founded the Mughal Empire. He ruled over India for 21 years. During his rule, India witnessed a golden age of peace and prosperity. His successors, however, were not as capable as he was. The empire declined after his death, but the Mughals remained an important part of Indian history for another 150 years. Now we will discuss some important questions that have been asked in UPSC and other competitive exams about this topic. Let's start with an easy question. What were the factors that contributed to the decline of the Lodi dynasty? The factors that contributed to the decline of the Lodi dynasty were internal conflicts, weak leadership, and external threats. Internal conflicts between the members of the Lodi family and the court nobles led to instability and weakened the central authority. The Lodi rulers were not strong enough to maintain control over the vast empire. The Sayyids before them had laid the foundation of the empire, but they were unable to expand it. The Lodis were also unable to do so. In fact, they lost some of the territories that the Sayyids had conquered. Ibrahim Lodi was a weak and ineffective ruler who was more interested in pleasure and luxury than in his duties. He failed to build a strong army and to make alliances with neighboring kingdoms. This made the Lodi dynasty vulnerable to external threats. Babur took advantage of this weakness and invaded India. He defeated Ibrahim Lodi and ended the Lodi dynasty. Next question. How was the Mughal army superior to the Lodi army? Babur's army was superior to the Lodi army in several ways. First, the Mughal army was more disciplined and better trained than the Lodi army. Babur had hired European soldiers known as the Italian band who were well-trained and efficient. Second, the Mughal army had better weapons and armor. Babur made sure that all his soldiers were well-equipped, so they were not afraid to attack the enemy. Third, the Mughal army had better artillery. Babur's cannons were more powerful and accurate than Ibrahim's cannons. Fourth, Babur's army had more cavalry than infantry. Cavalry were horse riders who fought on horseback, and they were deadlier than infantry. Babur also knew how to use his troops effectively. He exploited the weaknesses of Ibrahim's army and used his cavalry to great effect. He also had a clear plan of attack, and his troops followed his orders to the letter. On the other hand, Ibrahim's army was not well-trained, disciplined, or equipped. He did not have a good commander, and his troops were not loyal to him. Now we will discuss a difficult question. How did Babur manage to defeat Ibrahim Lodi despite being outnumbered? Babur managed to defeat Ibrahim Lodi despite being outnumbered due to a combination of factors. First, Babur's army was more elite and well-trained than Lodi's army. As we discussed earlier, the quality of troops is more important than the quantity. Second, Babur's artillery was far superior to Ibrahim's artillery. His cannons caused heavy casualties among Ibrahim's troops, while Ibrahim's cannons could not cause much damage to Babur's troops. Third, Babur had a clear plan of attack and his troops followed his orders to the letter. On the other hand, Ibrahim's army was not well organized and his troops were not loyal to him. They were not properly equipped and did not have a good commander. Furthermore, Babur's soldiers were motivated to fight against Ibrahim. They were promised pensions if they died in battle and their families would be taken care of. Babur's personal charisma also played a role in motivating his troops. He was a great leader who inspired his soldiers to fight bravely. In conclusion, Babur's victory over Ibrahim Lodi was not just a lucky strike. It was the result of careful planning, superior tactics, and a well-trained army. If you want to become a history expert, then subscribe to my channel. If you like this video, press the like button right now. Thank you for watching this video. We've all heard of the Battle of Kurukshetra and the Mahabharata, but have you ever wondered why the battle between the Kauravas and the Pandavas took place in Kurukshetra? Why not somewhere else? It turns out that there were three major battles that shook empires to their core in this very region. And each time it was because of this area's unique geography. So let us find out why Panipat has been the battleground of three empires in today's episode of. Before we begin, if you love history and have always wanted to learn more about it, our second channel is here to help you. You can watch detailed, well-researched videos on your favorite historical tales, including episodes on many ancient Indian battles. The link for the channel is provided below. Now coming back to the topic, Panipat is a small town in the state of Haryana, around 97 kilometers north of Delhi. Today, it's just another town in the busy national capital region. But in the past, it played a crucial role in the fate of empires and dynasties. Let's look at 3 such battles that happened near Panipat. The first one is the Battle of Kurukshetra. According to the ancient Indian epic Mahabharata, the battle between the Kauravas and the Pandavas took place over a period of 18 days. It is said that on the 18th day, all the Kaurava soldiers were killed except for the eldest, Yuyutsu, who surrendered before the Pandavas. It is believed that the last rites of the fallen warriors from both sides were performed on the banks of the Saraswati River. Now, according to Hindu tradition, when a king dies, his mortal remains are traditionally taken back to his capital for the final rituals. In the case of the Kauravas, since their kingdom was Hastinapura, which is modern-day Delhi, their dead would be taken back via Kurukshetra. The epic also mentions that after winning the war, Yudhishthira assembled an assembly of sages and scholars at Kurukshetra to draw up the rules of conduct and laws of living together for the entire human society. These rules came to be known as the Dharma Shastra. This place where Yudhishthira held the assembly is called Rajasuyasthal. Today, the small village of Tikri is believed to mark the spot. But why did Yudhishthira choose Kurukshetra for these important tasks? We'll tell you right after this. If you're finding our videos informative and entertaining, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you never miss out on any of our latest episodes. Do the same for our second channel. Coming back to the topic, you see, Kurukshetra is located at the center of a vast plain. This made it an ideal place to settle down and build a kingdom. Additionally, the fertile land was perfect for agriculture, providing ample food and resources for its people. During the Vedic times, this region was part of the Kuru kingdom, hence the name Kurukshetra. Over time, it became the heartland of the Mahabharata epic, attracting spiritual seekers and pilgrims from all over the world. Even today, Kurukshetra is considered one of the 7 sacred cities or Saptapuri in Hinduism. Every year, thousands of devotees visit Kurukshetra to pay homage to the great warriors and take a dip in the holy waters of the Saraswati River. Now moving on to the next battle, which is the Second Battle of Panipat in the year 1325 CE. By the early 14th century, the Delhi Sultanate had become a powerful force in northern India. Under the leadership of several sultans, they extended their rule over large parts of the subcontinent. However, by the end of the century, the Khilji dynasty had seized control of Delhi and its surrounding areas. This posed a serious threat to the expanding Mughal Empire, which bordered the Delhi Sultanate. To counter this threat, the Mongol ruler, Timur, set out to conquer Delhi. His army consisted of various Central Asian nomadic groups, Turks, Mongols, and Persians, among others. On the other hand, the Delhi Sultanate forces comprised primarily of Indian Muslims. Despite being outnumbered, the Sultanate army put up a fierce fight against Timur's troops, who were renowned for their military prowess. However, in the end, Timur's superior tactics and strategies prevailed and he won the battle. With this victory, Timur not only crushed the Delhi Sultanate's ambitions of expansion, but also established the supremacy of the Mughal Empire in northern India. So why did Timur choose Panipat to fight this decisive battle? One reason could be the open grasslands of Panipat, which provided enough space for his large cavalry force to maneuver and launch attacks. Another factor was the strategic location of Panipat, which allowed Timur's army to easily access the fertile agricultural lands of the Gangetic Plain, ensuring they had supplies for the duration of their campaign. Now let's discuss the Third Battle of Panipat, which took place in 1761 between the Maratha Empire and the invading forces of Ahmad Shah Abdali, who was the founder of the Afghan Empire. By the mid-18th century, the Maratha Empire had emerged as a major power in India, extending from the Arabian Sea in the west to the Bay of Bengal in the east. Their innovative military tactics and guerrilla warfare strategies had earned them victories against several rivals. On the other hand, Ahmad Shah Abdali, who was the founder of the Afghan Empire, aimed to curb the growing influence of the Marathas in the region. He sought support from other powers like the Mughals, the Afghans, and the Jats to form a coalition against the Marathas. Despite being outnumbered, the Marathas under the command of Sadasiva Rao and Ibrahim Gardi fought bravely against the invading forces. However, the Afghans were better equipped and had a strong artillery force, which eventually led to the Maratha defeat. Many notable Maratha leaders lost their lives in the battle, including the prominent General Raghojee Bansal, the Scindia family scion. The defeat at the Third Battle of Panipat had a significant impact on the Maratha Empire, weakening its power and marking a turning point in its history. So what made Panipat an essential part of this battle? Historians say that Panipat's strategic location at the crossroads of trade routes made it an essential stop for both the Marathas and the Afghans. This ensured that the armies had access to vital supplies and resources, contributing to the intensity and outcome of the battle. So there you have it, 3 major battles that changed the course of history, all happening in close proximity to each other in the plains of Panipat. Each battle had its own unique set of circumstances that led to it taking place here. Whether it was the central location for kingdoms or the strategic advantage it provided for large armies, Panipat's importance as a battleground cannot be overstated. It is fascinating to think about how this small town has witnessed so much bloodshed and destruction throughout history. But it is also a reminder of the importance of understanding our past in order to build a better future. We hope you enjoyed learning more about the significance of Panipat and its role in shaping Indian history. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to share this with your friends and subscribe for more exciting episodes. See you next time. Have you ever wondered why Akbar could conquer most of Hindustan, but his grandson Shah Jahan couldn't even hold on to half of it? How did the defeat of Babur at the First Battle of Panipat change the course of Mughal history? And how did it lead to the decline of one of the greatest empires in Indian history? This is the story of the First Battle of Panipat, the clash between Babur and Ibrahim Lodi that changed India forever. Welcome to our channel. Babur was ambitious. He wanted to expand his empire beyond the Indus River, which meant confronting the Delhi Sultanate, who controlled most of northern India. The Lodi dynasty had come to power only a generation before. Ibrahim Lodi was the second ruler of the dynasty, and he ruled over a vast realm from modern Pakistan to the Bay of Bengal. But his empire was not as strong as it seemed because he ruled like an absolute monarch with no regard for his nobles. In fact, he treated them worse than slaves. Ibrahim had a lot of enemies, the most powerful of whom was his own cousin, Dala Khan Lodi. When Babur heard about this infighting, he jumped at the opportunity to invade Hindustan. Babur sent a letter to Ibrahim inviting him for a friendly wrestling match, but in reality, it was just a ruse to lure him out. Then he attacked. Ibrahim was caught off guard and barely managed to escape with his life. He fled to his fortified city of Delhi and Babur chased after him, but Ibrahim was not ready to give up. He gathered an army and confronted Babur at the banks of the Yamuna River. The two armies faced each other on the plains of Panipat, now a small town near Delhi, but back then, it was a wide open plain without any cover. It was a perfect place to deploy cavalry, and both armies had plenty of it. Ibrahim's army was huge, maybe as large as 40,000, while Babur's army was much smaller, at least according to most historians. There were also some significant differences in their war elephants, artillery, and cavalry horses. Babur had just recently defeated the Uzbeks, so he had access to excellent Central Asian horses. Meanwhile, Ibrahim's horses were mostly Indian breeds like the Kathiawari and the Marwari, which were smaller and slower. Babur's artillery was also superior. His cannons could shoot farther and more accurately than Ibrahim's. Ibrahim, however, had a secret weapon, the musket. The musket was a new invention in the 16th century, and it soon became the dominant weapon in warfare across the world. The Lodi army had a few hundred musketeers, which made them very formidable. But they weren't as effective as they would have been in Europe. See, the thing about muskets is that they're slow and cumbersome. It takes a long time to load them and shoot them. So if the enemy is close enough, they can easily be taken out by swords or pikes. In close combat, they're almost useless, but Ibrahim didn't care. He deployed his musketeers in the front row, which may sound suicidal, but he had a plan. As the two armies met, the Mughal cavalry charged forward, led by Babur himself. Their excellent horses gave them the edge they needed. They easily broke through Ibrahim's front line. Then they started picking off the musketeers one by one. At this point, the musketeers should have retreated, but they didn't. They kept firing until their last breath, and somehow the Mughal cavalry couldn't break through. Meanwhile, on the other side, Ibrahim's infantry was engaging Babur's artillery. They knew that if the guns fell into enemy hands, they would be dead. But they also knew that they couldn't capture them, so they tried to distract the gunners. Slowly but surely, they started pushing them back. Things weren't going well for Babur. His cavalry had broken through Ibrahim's front line, but they couldn't advance any further because of the stubborn musketeers. And his artillery was being pushed back by Ibrahim's infantry. It seemed like the battle was going Ibrahim's way when suddenly the rains came. It poured heavily, turning the battlefield into a muddy mess. The horses got tired and the musketeers got soaked. The element of surprise was gone. Babur regrouped his cavalry and charged once again, this time with full force. Ibrahim's musketeers were no match for them. They were wiped out in minutes. Then Babur turned his attention to the rest of the Lodi army. They had already lost their momentum and were exhausted from the constant fighting. It didn't take long for Babur to defeat them. Ibrahim was forced to flee once again, this time without his son. Badr Shah Zafar captured Ibrahim and his son, along with many nobles and princes, and executed them all. Ibrahim's head was cut off and hung from the gate of the Delhi fort as a warning to anyone who dared challenge the mules. With the victory at Panipat, Babur conquered most of northern India. He established the Mughal Empire there and became the Emperor of Hindustan. After that, Babur went back to Kabul and spent his last years expanding his empire in Central Asia. He died in 1530, but his legacy lived on. His successors continued to expand the Mughal Empire. Under Akbar, it reached its peak, but after him, the empire started to crumble. Akbar's successors were not as capable as he was. Jahangir was too interested in art and Shah Jahan was too obsessed with building beautiful buildings. Both of them neglected their duties and the empire suffered because of it. Aurangzeb was different though. He was a good administrator and a great warrior. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent and made it the wealthiest it had ever been. But he was also a religious fanatic. He tried to convert everyone to Islam and that caused a lot of problems. After Aurangzeb, the mules never recovered. Their successors were weak and the empire was divided into smaller states. Eventually, it was completely wiped out. So what went wrong? Why didn't the mules stay on top? Why did they go from being the masters of India to being nothing but a memory? Well, there are many theories about this. Some historians say that the Mughal emperors were too busy enjoying themselves to do their jobs. Others say that they were too focused on ruling the big cities to care about the countryside. Yet others say that the rise of regional kingdoms was inevitable and the mules were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But we think there's something else going on here, something that nobody seems to be talking about. You see, the Mughal emperors were not stupid. They knew that they couldn't hold on to all of their territories forever, so they did something. They set up a system to ensure that their empire would last as long as possible. They built forts and administrative centers all over the country and appointed governors to oversee them. These governors were loyal to the emperor and were given the power to raise taxes and maintain order in their provinces. In theory, this was a great idea. It allowed the Mughal Empire to function without the direct involvement of the emperor. But in reality, it created a lot of problems. See, the Mughal emperors were very generous with land. They gave away huge tracts of it to their nobles and relatives. Over time, this led to a situation where the majority of the population lived on land owned by others. They had to pay rent and taxes to their landlords, who in turn had to pay rent and taxes to the Mughal emperor. This system worked well for a while, but it eventually led to a lot of resentment. The peasants started to hate their landlords and the landlords started to hate the Mughal emperor. When Aurangzeb came to power, the hatred finally boiled over. The peasants revolted against their landlords and the landlords revolted against Aurangzeb. By the end of Aurangzeb's reign, the Mughal Empire was in ruins. So why does any of this matter? Why should you care about the fall of the Mughal Empire? Well, because it's not just a historical footnote, it's a cautionary tale. A reminder that even the greatest empires can fall if they do and pay attention to the needs of their people. The Mughal emperors were so focused on keeping their wealth and power that they forgot about the most important thing of all, their people. They took their loyalty and support for granted and they paid the price. The decline of the Mughal Empire was not caused by a single battle or a single person. It was the result of decades, even centuries of bad decisions. The Battle of Panipat was just one small part of that story. But that doesn't mean it wasn't an important one. Without Babur's victory at Panipat, the Mughal Empire would have never happened. And without the Mughal Empire, India would be a very different place today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave us a like and a comment. And don't forget to subscribe for more great episodes. Thank you for watching. It is said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Nowhere is this more true than at the town of Panipat in northern India. This small city is the stage for 3 battles which changed the course of Indian history over a period of 400 years. These are the 3 battles of Panipat. The first Battle of Panipat was fought in the year 1526. The armies were completely different from one another. Babur, the leader of the forces which won the battle, was so shocked to see the size of the elephant army of the Sultan of Delhi that he called it a sea of elephants. His troops used superior firearms technology to destroy them. Babur's victory led to the establishment of the Mughal Empire in India. Fast forward 213 years to January 5, 1761, the Second Battle of Panipat sees the Afghans fight against the Marathas, who have come to be known as India's unconquerable army. The Afghan commander, Ahmad Shah Abdali, has a trick up his sleeve. He pits the hot and thirsty Marathas against a force of 50,000 elephants and beats them. This victory allows him to plunder the wealth of central India. Now forward 165 years to December 18, 1939, Britain and Germany are at war. Subhas Chandra Bose, leader of the Indian National Army, or the INA, wants to end British rule in India once and for all. The INA marches into India. Bose thinks he can defeat the British by copying their tactics. But again, the British have an ace up their sleeve. They use tanks. This is the Third Battle of Panipat, and it's the only time that 3 great empires collide on the same battlefield. It's me, and now let's go back in time to find out what happened here. At about 10 a.m. on the morning of April 1, 1526, the armies met near the town of Panipat, situated on the fertile Indo-Gangetic plain. The Sultan Ibrahim Lodi, ruler of Delhi, was outnumbered. He had an army of around 40 to 50,000 soldiers, while Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, had an army of around 120,000. However, numbers can be deceptive. Lodi's army consisted entirely of infantry and cavalry, with the exception of 6 elephants. Babur, on the other hand, fielded 21,000 cavalrymen, 250 elephants, and 40 pieces of artillery. He also had a secret weapon, gunpowder. In the 16th century, firearms were not common in India. Most armies were made up of swordsmen on horseback or on foot. Swords and bows and arrows were the main weapons. Military engineers were unheard of. So when Lodi's elephants charged across the field, firing volleys of arrows at the Mughal lines, they caused massive casualties. These giant animals were nearly 12 feet tall and weighed almost 2 tons. They carried towers on their backs, which could hold up to 4 men each. From these towers, soldiers fired their muskets and shot down dozens of Muslims. Elephants were revered in India and considered divine. No wonder Babur was shocked. He wrote in his memoirs that he had never seen such large bodies trampling in such numbers and creating such havoc. But Babur's gunpowder-wielding cavalrymen managed to pierce through the enemy ranks. When they charged the elephant corps, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. One after the other, elephants fell. They tried to flee, but the ground was soft and muddy, making it impossible for them to move. In total, 40 elephants were killed. The rest retreated along with Ibrahim Lodi. Babur chased them and caught up with Lodi near the river Yamuna. There, the last remnants of Ibrahim Lodi's army surrendered. Having secured victory, Babur's attention turned to plunder. He permitted his soldiers to pillage the defeated sultan's camp. According to some accounts, Ibrahim Lodi's wife and daughters were taken prisoner during the raid. Soon after, Babur entered Agra, the capital of Delhi, and thus the Mughal Empire was established in India. Fast forward to the 18th century, a young man named Balaji Vishwanath is appointed Peshwa or Prime Minister of the Maratha Empire. Under his leadership, the Marathas became a formidable force to reckon with. After defeating the Nizam of Hyderabad in 1720, they began advancing toward the northwest of India. There they encountered the Afghans. Ahmad Shah Abdali was the founder of the Afghan Empire. He was worried that the expanding Maratha domain was threatening his empire. Tensions rose, and in 1759, the Afghans invaded Maratha territory. The following year, the Marathas, under the command of Sadasiva Rao, marched to Panipat to confront them. The two armies met on the banks of the Yamuna River. The Marathas were confident of victory. Their army of 32,000 cavalrymen was accompanied by 2,000 infantry. On the other side of the battlefield, Ahmad Shah Abdali had an army of 60,000 infantrymen and 26,000 horsemen, not to mention 50,000 elephants. It was yet another mismatch like the one Babur faced 200 years before. But this time it was the Marathas who were in for a rude shock. The Afghans, along with their allies, the Jats and the Rajputs, attacked first. The Marathas, exhausted from their long campaign, found themselves pinned down on the banks of the Yamuna. They managed to repel the initial attack, but when the elephants came thundering down the hill, they were in trouble. There were just too many elephants. The Marathas suffered heavy losses. And when night fell, they realized they had lost more than half their soldiers. To make things worse, a water pipe burst and the entire Maratha camp was flooded, killing many soldiers and forcing the survivors to flee. Sadasiva Rao barely managed to escape with 5,000 cavalrymen. Ahmad Shah Abdali plundered Maratha territory and returned safely to Afghanistan. The Afghans had won, but the victory came at a cost. They, too, had suffered heavy losses. Now fast forward to World War II. The year is 1939. At the time, India was still under British rule. When Germany declared war on India, the British Viceroy Lord Linlithgow asked the Indian soldiers to ignore the Germans and focus on the Japanese threat from the east. Many Indians felt betrayed. They had been told that if they fought for the British, they would be rewarded with independence. Now they saw the war as an opportunity to throw off the British yoke once and for all. On October 21st, Subhash Chandra Bose, a prominent leader of the Indian independence movement, landed in Germany. A few months later, he reached Berlin, where he met Adolf Hitler and convinced him to support an Indian revolt against the British. Hitler agreed and trained Bose's army. He also gave them arms and ammunition. Meanwhile, in India, people began to rally around Bose's banner. By November, the Indian National Army had grown to include 2,000 troops and a sizable number of volunteers. With supplies from Japan and Germany, the INA marched into India and headed for Delhi. The British sent troops to stop them, but the INA kept winning. Soon, they had captured several key cities. By December, the INA and the British were facing each other at Panipat. The INA was led by Lieutenant General Shahnawaz Khan. His deputy was Major General K.M. Karyappa, a veteran of the Second World War. Opposite them stood Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Percival, commander of the British forces in India. When the two armies met, the British numbered 58,000 while the INA had 28,000 soldiers. The INA had no artillery, but what it lacked in firepower, it made up for in courage and tenacity. The INA soldiers were well-trained and determined to win. The British, on the other hand, were exhausted and demoralized. After all, most of them had been fighting in Burma for years. As soon as the INA crossed the river, the battle began. The British opened fire and the INA responded with everything they had. The fighting continued throughout the day. Neither side could gain the upper hand. When the sun set, both armies retreated. The next morning, the INA attacked again. Their goal was to capture Delhi and reach the Indian Ocean. If they could control the ocean, they could cut off India's supply lines and starve the British out. But the British were prepared. They had laid mines all along the river. As the INA advanced, the mines exploded, killing and wounding many. Seeing that their positions were being destroyed, the INA soldiers fled. The British chased them and forced them to retreat all the way back to their base. There they received a message from Tokyo. Japan had surrendered to the Allies. Without Japanese support, the INA's hopes for independence were dashed. Shahnawaz Khan surrendered his weapons and became a prisoner of the British. Many of his soldiers did the same. Some escaped, but those who stayed behind were arrested and taken to jails across India. Over the next few decades, Bose's legacy faded away, but the demand for independence didn't. On August 15, 1947, India gained independence. The country was divided into modern India and Pakistan. Both countries fought a war over Kashmir, which resulted in the deaths of thousands. India has never been the same since. Today, the country is home to more than 1 billion people and its economy is growing at a rapid pace. But India still faces many challenges: poverty, inequality, and religious tensions. As we look to the future, it's important to remember the sacrifices of those who fought for India's freedom. The INA may have failed, but their sacrifice paved the way for a free India. And with that, our journey through the 3 battles of Panipat has come to an end. Which battle was your favorite? Do let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.